Look, guys, our channel member here, Guillermo Mole 123, sent this really interesting question. Julio, was there any Italian officer or general who was really good and had an interesting story or notable ability that we probably don't know about since Italy was very weak? So I always like to touch on this subject of Italy, right? Because you guys probably already know, right? Those of you who have been following the channel for a while. Whenever I make content about Italy, I try not to fall into that cliche that Italy was a disaster, that Italy, only caused trouble, Italy this, Italy that. Man, yeah, there are reasons for Italy's poor performance, and many of those reasons are in Mussolini's arrogant policy of putting the country into war without full preparation, right? And I think that's what ended up making Italy perform so poorly, right? So badly overall in World War II. We have to understand that a big part of what makes a soldier fight, and when I say soldier, I don't just mean the guy on the ground. It goes all the way up to the general, right? In other words, what makes a military man fight is largely related to the reason he believes he's fighting for, right? Yeah. In other words, the soldier has to be filled with the fighting spirit, with what the state tells him is the reason he has to fight. He doesn't just go there and fight for no reason. If you just tell him to go there and fight, he'll fight half-heartedly. He'll fight in a rather erratic way. But if you motivate the guy, he'll fight much better. It's very different. We've seen that, right? Although I don't even need to discuss this fact, we've seen it in practice. With Germany, right? The German soldiers in general had a very strong reason to go to war, right? The government instilled this reason in them. The Soviet soldier had a very strong reason to fight. The American soldier had a very strong reason to fight because he also felt like a victim after Pearl Harbor. And the government also knew how to use this justification very well to motivate the American soldier to fight. So everyone there thought that war was a just war. Italy, man, it's different because the fascist government didn't really cultivate that ideological closeness with Germany, you know? And especially the antagonism toward England and France, who had been allies just 20 years earlier. 20 years before they were allies, they had won the war together, and now they would have to be enemies. That's a factor that really influences, right, the behavior of the Italian forces in World War II. So I try to analyze the behavior of the Italian generals, of the Italian officers, as something that derives a lot from these alliances that the country had, and that the country achieved a very important victory in 1918. Alongside these countries, and now suddenly, they would have to flip that alliance around. So those officers who didn't feel very close to the fascist regime, they had a clear alternative in Italy, which was to get closer to the monarchy, which was to stay close to the monarchy and the traditional nobility of Italy. Was this, for example, an alternative in Germany? No, that alternative didn't exist. In Italy, it did. So this means that the level of trust that the army, that the armed forces have with the high command of the Axis is lower than with other forces. Okay? So we're going to see the following. The Italian military school is an extremely conservative school. Okay? An extremely outdated school, I would even say. Pietro Badoglio, Marshal Pietro Badoglio, spent a good part of 15 years as the head of the general staff, and everything the army became is because of this long tenure of Badoglio in command of the Italian army in the 1920s and 1930s. So we can clearly observe how the Italian general, when well led, and I mean when he is He is acting in partnership with the Germans, right? Acting within a German chain of command. The Italian general, who is the brigadier general or major general, he performs better than when he is under an exclusively Italian chain of command. Where are we going to see this? We are going to see this in Africa, and we are going to see this in the Soviet Union. So I set aside here to answer Guilherme's question. I picked 3 examples. 3 generals whose personalities I consider very effective. In World War II, they were considered by their peers, even by their own German peers, right? Because they were decorated by the Germans with high honors, right? And they are generally recognized as good tactical leaders. Okay? Good tactical leaders. So we can start this list. I won't go on for too long, nor make a list of 30 Italian generals like I did in those lives about Hitler's generals. But here, to keep it more compact, 3 generals. The first one, guys, is this guy in the middle here. Look, who is General Giovanni Messe. Actually, he became a marshal, right? So, Marshal Giovanni Messe. Yeah, he was serving. In 1941, he was serving there in the Balkans, okay? In other words, in the region of the former Yugoslavia, right? He was serving in the Balkans. When Benito Mussolini decided to form an Italian expeditionary corps to fight in the Soviet Union together with the Germans, right? In Operation Barbarossa. This expeditionary corps was placed under the command of a general named Francesco Zingales. But this guy left Italy on a train, right, heading to the Soviet Union. And in Vienna, he had to get off the train because he got sick, man. He got sick there. I don't know what kind of illness it was. But Zingales had to be replaced as the commander of the Italian Expeditionary Corps in Russia, okay? By another general who turned out to be General Giovanni Messe. Okay, so for all intents and purposes, when the CSIR, or Italian Expeditionary Corps in Russia, arrived in the Soviet Union at the end of August or the beginning of September, I don't remember exactly. Right, very well. But Giovanni Messe was the commander, and he was the guy who reported directly to Gerd von Rundstedt, okay? So he reported directly to Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of Army Group South. And among Giovanni Messe's troops were these guys you're seeing here. Look around him here, look. The Bersaglieri, right? They're the light infantry, a highly capable infantry force, right? Very well trained, better equipped. They're considered the elite of the Italian army's infantry, right? So the Bersaglieri wear these rooster feathers on their helmets. And among the 3 divisions, right, that Giovanni Messe had under his command in the Soviet Union, Pasubio Torino and Amadeo Duca d'Aosta, there was the 6th Bersaglieri Regiment. And the 6th Bersaglieri Regiment was really like a pretty tough unit, right? Because it was the one that led the advance of the Italian Expeditionary Corps and conquered the city of Donetsk, right? Today it's called Donetsk. At the time it was called Stalino, okay? So they were the ones who captured Stalino during the final months of Barbarossa in 1941. And Giovanni Messe was considered an easygoing officer, right? In other words, he was a guy who wanted to get along with his superiors. He made a point of having a good relationship with the German superiors. And because of that, right, he was well treated by the German superiors, right? He didn't force that nationalism that often turns into resentment between the two groups of officers, right? The German and the Italian. So, as you can see there on Giovanni Messe's neck, at the very end of 1941, I believe, December, right? Because of the excellent campaign that the Italian Expeditionary Corps had carried out, Giovanni Messe was awarded the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross. You can see it on his neck. So he and another general, Fedeli de Giorgis, I'm not sure if that's it. I can't remember the other general's name right now. No, Ugo de Carolis. I just remembered now. Ugo de Carolis, who was the commander of one of his divisions, was also awarded the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, although Ugo de Carolis, I believe, passed away shortly after, okay? Fideli de Georgis received this Knight's Cross at the same time during the same period, but at Halfaya Pass, over there in Africa, right? So Giovanni Messe was one of the only eight Italian officers to be awarded the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross. Only eight. All right, so one of them was Giovanni Messe. And we can say that other Italian officers, right, like for example, General Giulio Martina, have already received the Iron Cross posthumously. There are 3 submarine commanders, and there's an Iron Cross that I consider to be kind of political, right, which is the one given to General Italo Garibaldi, who replaced Giovanni Messe, in command of the Italian troops in Russia in 1942, when the troops were expanded into the 8th Italian Army, right? Yeah, so Giovanni Messe, man, once he leaves the command of the KSIR, right, in the Soviet Union, at the very beginning of November 1942, look at how the timeline of events was also beneficial for Giovanni Messe. He leaves just a few days before. He leaves the command, abandons the command just a few days before Operation Uranus, right? The Soviet counteroffensive in Stalingrad, which would devastate the 8th Italian Army in the Soviet Union, right? So he leaves, gives up the command, and a few days later, the disaster happens. And where is he going to be sent? He's going to be sent to North Africa at the beginning of 1943 to take command of the First Army, the First Italo-German Army. Do you understand? First Italo-German Army. So, Giovanni Messe, in the last months of the North African campaign, he is the only Italian officer in World War II to take command of a large German unit, which was the First Army, okay? So you can see that he stands out compared to the other Italian officers, right? And he, even after the armistice, right, he still got command of the Italian troops, right, pro-monarchy in southern Italy, right, the Italian troops that were pro-allies. He got the command. So he's a guy who, enjoyed high prestige both with the Germans when he was allied with them and with the Allies when he was allied with them, right? So Giovanni Messe, he really went down in history as a prominent figure, when it comes to Italian generals of World War II. So remember the name of Marshal Giovanni Messe, okay? Yeah, the second guy I'm going to talk to you about is this one right here, you see, with his hands placed in front of his mouth. And this other guy in the middle, very well, exactly who he is, General Erwin Rommel, right here in the middle. And as I told you, the one with his hands near his mouth there is General Enea Navarini. Okay? So, Enea Navarini, Enea is Aeneas, right, in Italian. Enea Navarini was a corps commander of the 21st Army Corps, which had the division, the Trento Mechanized Infantry Division, and if I'm not mistaken, the Bologna Infantry Division. Both were commanded by Enea Navarini from, if I remember correctly, August 1941. That is about 6 months after Rommel arrived in Africa, right? And in Africa, man, Navarini is one of the best examples that can illustrate what I told you today at the beginning of the video, which is Italian generals under German command tend to perform better than under Italian army command. That is purely Italian command. So of course it's not an absolute rule, but many of these guys ended up performing much better than under purely Italian command. And how can we measure that? What's the importance of that? I always emphasize this whenever I can, man, because it's a statistic that not many people take into consideration, right? Rommel in North Africa had under his command for most of his time there the equivalent of a corps, which was later, of course, expanded to the equivalent of an army. Okay? But at all times, or in the vast majority of time frames during the North Africa campaign, 70% of Rommel's equipment was Italian, man. Okay? Let me repeat that for you. 70% of Rommel's equipment was Italian. Tanks, the Panthers. Most of Rommel's tanks never stopped being Italian. Okay? The Ariete Division. The Trento Division, right? Later on, other units, other Italian armored units, ended up outnumbering the German vehicles in Rommel's armored force. Of course, nowadays we don't hear about that, right? Of course, most of the portrayals of Rommel in the North African campaign in books and movies on TV are going to show only German vehicles, but that's not the case. The Italians had more tanks in Africa than the Germans, okay? So Italian artillery was always superior to German artillery in numbers in North Africa. Italian heavy field artillery, 120 millimeters or above, was superior to the German artillery in numbers in North Africa. So here you can see Rommel having a conference with his staff officers, the taller one, right? And General Navarini is sitting, and Navarini's advisor is standing there, right? The one with glasses is also Italian, okay? The other three are Germans, but the one with glasses is Italian, and Navarini is here with Rommel. Navarini. Yes, Navarini. He was one of Rommel's favorites. He was one of the guys Rommel valued most in the North African theater of operations. He was an Italian general, Ennio Navarini. Okay? What happened at the end of 1942? Ennio Navarini relinquished command. That is, he passed command to another general of the 21st Army Corps at the beginning of December. Sorry, at the beginning of October 1942. I think it was October 10, 1942. Do you know what happened? 13 days later, on October 23, Montgomery launched the counteroffensive at El Alamein, the second Battle of El Alamein, the most important one in North Africa, right? Which caught the Axis off guard there. And Rommel, by the way, was where? In Germany. Rommel returned urgently to North Africa to try to put out the fire there. Now, look, pay attention to what I'm going to say. Do you know what Rommel did when he arrived in North Africa? Rommel personally demanded the return of Enea Navarini to command the 21st Corps. Rommel filed the request for General Navarini to return. Why? Because he didn't trust the others, the new commanders, the new commander. He didn't trust them. He thought the guy was bland. He personally asked for the guy's return, and he got it, right? Navarini returned to command of the 21st Corps in the final phase of the Battle of El Alamein, okay? So, Enea Navarini is also one of only 3 Italian servicemen to be awarded the German Cross in gold. Called the fried egg, right? The one with the round decoration with the swastika in the middle. Right, that was worn here under the pocket, under the right pocket of the uniform, right? So of the 3 Italians, General Enea Navarini. And after the Italian armistice, Enea Navarini managed to reach the north of the country, where the Germans were occupying Italian territory. And there he became the commander of the special forces of the armed forces of the RSI, right? Italian Social Republic, okay? So finally, I have one last name here that you guys will like to know about, okay? I think a lot of people have already heard about him, but not in these terms, okay? It's this guy here. Look at this guy. Look at this guy here. And, by the way, this photo of him was taken on an occasion most of you already know about. This photo here was taken during the surrender of the German 148th Division and the Italian divisions, right? In Fornovo di Taro. There in Italy. To whom? To the Brazilian Expeditionary Force. This guy I'm pointing out to you here is General Mario Carlone. Of the two general officers who surrendered to the Brazilian Expeditionary Force on April 29th, 1945, right? So why am I mentioning Mario Carlone here, man? Because Carlone, he has more of a tactical leadership style, focused on small units, not on commanding an army or an army corps like Messe and Navarini, okay? He operates on a smaller scale, at the regiment, brigade, and small division level. So Mario Carlone, at the beginning of 1942, he was serving in Crete, right? On the island of Crete, down there in the Mediterranean, right? When he received some very, very sad news for him, which was that his son, Bruno Carlone, a lieutenant, had perished in combat with the 6th Bersaglieri Regiment in the Soviet Union. Okay? So, he died in combat there in the early stages of Operation Blue, right? So, while the Axis was advancing to the north bank of the Don River towards Stalingrad, and Bruno Carlone, in fact, was posthumously awarded the Medaglia d'Oro al Valor Militare, which is the gold medal for military valor, which is the equivalent of the Medal of Honor or the Knight's Cross, right, for Italy. So look at what happened. Carlone was very, very resentful of the Soviets, and he requested command there in the Soviet Union. He was a colonel at the time, and it was granted to him, you know? Which command, man? He was granted command of the 6th Bersaglieri Regiment. So, in October 1942, Carlone arrived in the Soviet Union to command the unit his son had fought and died in, right? So Carlone, he will lead the 6th Bersaglieri Regiment during this period of Operation Uranus and Operation Little Saturn, which follows Uranus, right? So these are two major Soviet encirclements of Army Group south of the Wehrmacht and its allies. In fact, Operation Little Saturn hits the 8th Italian Army hard, right? It's going to dismantle a large part of it. And by January 1943, with Operation Winter Storm already having failed, they went there to try to withdraw the 6th Army from Stalingrad. After that ended in failure, ended in defeat. Erich von Manstein, commander of the Army Group Don, then orders a general retreat from the Caucasus, from the Donetsk Basin, right? Retreat to the Dnieper region in the center of Ukraine. So, in a city called Pavlograd, a vanguard of the Red Army, about 20,000 men, tried to tighten the encirclement against Axis troops that were retreating to the western region, right? To the western region of Ukraine. Do you know what happened in the city of Pavlograd? That's with the whole troop plunged into anarchy, plunged into disorder. Carlone, he forms a force of Italian troops centered on the 6th Bersaglieri Regiment, which became known as the Carlone Column. Okay? The Carlone Column then holds the city of Pavlograd. It holds the bridges, the access routes, and the city of Pavlograd against a force equivalent to 2 Soviet divisions, 20,000 Soviet soldiers. And the Bersaglieri, they really sacrificed themselves with a very high number of casualties to keep the Axis escape route open. So that's where the Italian units escape, German and Romanian units as well. They escape through the corridor that Carlone keeps open.
Então, uma vez que
This ensures that the evacuation is completed.
é,
Carlone becomes one of the three, as I told you too, of the three Italian officers who are decorated with the German cross in gold. The second highest German decoration for bravery, right? So Carlone and Navarini are two of the three, right? So Mario Carlone, of the two generals captured by the FEB, is one of those guys who were also comparatively highly decorated by the Germans. He, shortly after that, returns to Italy and has to face the situation of the Italian armistice. He is initially arrested by the Germans and taken to Berlin. Then he is released because he swears allegiance to the RSI and he is made commander of the new Alpine Division, formed for Mussolini's new armed forces, right, which is the Monte Rosa Alpine Division. You also know, those who study the history of the FEB know that the Monte Rosa was the main unit involved in those assaults against the FEB vanguards on October 31, 1944. But Mario Carlone will take command of the Monte Rosa on the front line only at the beginning of November. In other words, it's shortly after that counterattack against the FEB on October 31. But do you know what Mario Carlone is going to do on December 26, 1944, man? Mario Carlone is going to carry out the Christmas offensive, or the small winter Gevita operation, right? The winter storm, which is launched against the 92nd Division, the Buffalo Division. They're in the Apennines. Okay? It's going to be very successful there, by the way, right? Conquering several cities there: Como, Como Colonia, around Como, Como Colonia, Barga. So, the operational success of the Axis is due to the command of Mario Carlone. So he's a guy who, despite the Axis's limited options in that region, also managed to achieve success. He managed to achieve success in a very adverse situation, right? So he's also, one of the prominent Italian generals, right? By the standards he was operating under, right? Given the limitations he faced, we can say that Mario Carlone is one of those Italian generals who was better than average, okay? So guys, these three are three officers that I consider to be officers who took action and who showed talent, right? Within a German chain of command, they showed talent that most of their colleagues did not. So now you tell me if you have any other Italian name to add to this list. If you like this answer and want to learn even more about military history, you can buy my book, O Atomo Como Arma, which will teach you everything about the creation, development, and use of atomic bombs in World War II. You can buy it at the We Clap store via the link in the description or the QR code on screen. And if you want this book here autographed with a dedication for you, just send an email to saladeguerra.com with your zip code so I can calculate the shipping.